this is on to the last one. We might rerun this series later in the year after the end of financial year, because might be beneficial once budgets are in place, once you have a bit more structure, and go ahead with that. Today's agenda, just a quick touch on the report that we've launched on SSP. We're going to understand the metrics and targets pillar, answer questions as they go with Loki or at the end, but feel free to make it as participative as possible. One thing that I want to bring up, we always have another event coming up at NetNada. We don't stop. Loki and one of our partners are going to be hosting a webinar on June 3rd. Loki, do you want to speak to that for a second?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, just a really exciting time, as Afonso's alluded to in a few of the previous webinars, that we now know the path moving forward. And since the election, it's very clear, what the strategy is from a government perspective. And so this webinar is really about looking over the next 3 years, seeing what the implications of the election are, and also seeing not just from a strategic point, as you can see in the title there, but also seeing the opportunities. Julian put opportunities in there before in the chat. We have a huge task ahead of us as a country to meet our 2030 targets and our 2050 net zero targets. And the government is, of course, trying to push this along with incentivized programs and grants and driving that renewables transition. So there's a lot of opportunities for businesses to take advantage of this. And that's what this session is going to be all about.
Awesome. And yeah, and Smart Commercial Solar are one of our partners. As you know, we partner with consultancies and service providers and solution providers. So it's nice to see these coming along. You probably know how to use Zoom by now, but any questions, raise your hand, put in the Q&A, and we'll look at the chat. And now, as you always know, a quick recap, because we can never say it often, on what this is all about. One thing that I want to always double down on is understanding the primary users of this disclosure. Super important. And most likely the primary users of this disclosure includes financial related people like banks, investors, private equity, and so forth. So it's really important that you understand that the name of this disclosure is climate related financial disclosures, and we look at climate related risks and opportunities as well. So what can your company do into the future to capture this opportunity of a changing climate, in a sense? Of course, understand how this impacts the cash of your business and how easy it is to borrow money and how much it costs to borrow that money. This is straight from the legislation. For whom, for how long, and what. So you look at climate-related physical risks and the impact of that, and the transition as well. So a good example, temperature rises, storms, bushfires, and also new changes in the markets, new laws, new technologies, and how does your organization shapes into that. Okay, so always go back to legislation if you can. If not, talk to us, because we can do the bridging between the boring text and something that's easiest to digest. Also super important, in the law that was passed, there is 2 standards. We focus in these webinars on the S2, which is the climate related, not sustainability related, and that is mandatory. The one that is related to sustainability, it is only voluntary for organizations to disclose to that, while the other one, if you meet the criteria, it is mandatory. So really important to understand where this sits. Another thing that was introduced, as you all know, is assurance. Not everything that you report needs to be assured, but you still need to report it. Okay? So just because that your transition plan is not going to be assured doesn't mean that you don't need to disclose that to comply with the legislation. So it's really important differentiation, because some people at one point got confused. Okay, scope 3 is not included, and so it's not transition plan. No, it's the level of assurance that it's different on your first year of disclosure. Super key point. You can always bring it home, and you can always educate your internal stakeholders, your consultant, your clients about this particular topic. Super easy table to memorize, but also always have at your fingertips as well, and how that changes over time. So if you've been to all the 5 webinars, you've seen this before, but always good to recap in that sense. Now, what is the prep for metrics and targets? This is where we are today on the last pillar. By now, because it involves reporting on strategies and different things, you could have already some documentation, some policies that help you guide your metrics and targets. However, you can do this in parallel to make it happen. One super important thing that you need to be able to nail this section is your inventory. So this is your carbon emissions inventory. But by this point, you also want to involve your finance, your legal, your risk team, and your leadership, because you need to sign off on the targets that we're going to cover, on the metrics, and how you do such things. We have compiled a lot of documentation in NetNata, and we've put it inside a platform in our disclosure modules. So we kind of facilitate a bit of, okay, what policies do I need? What do the templates look like? But it's always good to refer back to your own structure of governance, if you have one, or your file keeping, and bring those things to life as you go to your pre-assurance journey, as you go to your disclosure journey, and understand how things fit together in the different requirements. All right, so remember, this is a team game. We need finance, we need legal, we need the sustainability team, we need risk, and we need ops as well. And finally, we need the sign off from leadership to make this section happen.
Awesome.
Any questions on that to begin with?
I'll start off with a question, Afonso, and everyone here. I know we all go to enough webinars that there's always that planted question that the co-host like me tries to pretend was from someone from the audience. This is not from someone from the audience. This is me, and this is not pre-prepared for Afonso. I think a good thing is to put ourselves in the shoes and ask, Fons, what do you see as the biggest challenge for organizations preparing for their metrics and targets?
One of the biggest challenge or biggest reframing is that, especially in the component of emissions, we always thought about the number, and this is my total emissions or my separation between scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Now, how you get there and the methodology behind it is as important, because you need to document and show that to a very good degree of transparency and robustness. So the do-it-yourself, or maybe using someone else that's functions like a bit of a black box, doesn't work anymore, because you need that methodologies in those processes and documentations. So that's a key thing. And the other one is you want to report on things that you've never seen before, and setting targets that might be the first time that you're ever looking at things like assets exposed to physical risks or transition opportunities. And so it's a bit, I need to do the work on measuring that before I can even set a target. So that's one of the two biggest challenges that I see.
Okay, awesome. And I know from today's slides, we're going to jump right into all of the steps and suggestions for companies considering right now how they're going to overcome these challenges. So, yeah, that's great. Thanks for that.
No worries. All right.
Any other questions before we get going? You have your chance, team. No. Okay. Sorry, Fons.
No worries, and please stop me at any time and put me on the spot. All right. Understanding metrics and targets under AASB S2. This is the core content of the session. And if you need to remember one thing on one takeaway after this session, it is more than just emissions reporting. Okay, that's
Fons,
the
so we've just got a hand raised from Jati. I might allow him to talk if that works. No. Jati, if you raise your hand again, I can allow you to talk, or if you want to put it in the chat, you can do that. Oh, no, he hit the wrong button. Okay.
All right.
My bad.
Let's see what needs to be reported. Like I said, biggest takeaway, it is more than just your emissions. You have to report things like capital allocation, internal carbon pricing if you use one, how these metrics are tied to executive remuneration, and a couple other things. So, like I said, the biggest takeaway is it is not just about emissions, but it does have a very underlying linkage between all of them. Okay, so we have to look at the targets, how they're set, how they're measured, and how they're tracked over time. Okay, who's involved? Like I've mentioned, you cannot do this by yourself in your sustainability function. You'll need to involve several stakeholders, and those stakeholders might even sit outside your organization. If you want to look into now maybe technologies or decarbonization pathways, there might be a vendor that you need to make this happen. So you might need to inform your decisions or how possible your goals are by speaking with people outside your organization. That might be an industry body, might be a vendor, technology provider, legislation, and so forth. Internally, look at your management and boards, look at your risk, and of course the procurement and the finance is super important because this is about capital allocation, cash flow forecasts, and so forth. So
And
sits not only in sustainability.
and Fons, can I just jump in here is a really good point with who's involved and how do you implement this? Carbon pricing is such an interesting lever that companies have been using for a long time. And there's a really good example where Microsoft actually has, for a long time, had an internal carbon fee where they charge internally business units around $100 a ton for emissions to make sure that they're baking in that carbon cost into all of their day-to-day decisions. So, for example, if a division within Microsoft wants to expand, create a new data center, they're going to then be accounting for the carbon fee in their budget, which is making everyone and the who's involved, making everyone think about how to encourage renewables, green power, greater efficiency because it's part of the business model.
And I think it makes it easier as well, right? If you're going to then do strategic decisions, it's way easier if you have already that internal pricing to guide what's next. You know,
100%. And I know we've got lots of people here in the room who, are part of the safeguard mechanism, so they're super used to the credit price. In Australia, sitting somewhere around $75 a ton. So there's lots of examples to pull on, but Microsoft are doing a lot of great things, and I think they're worth a mention there.
yeah. And like I said, how is it done? Just looking at, if you look at the assurance piece, it's important to understand, your scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3 because it's going to impact your strategies. One thing as well is AASB allows you to use the GHG protocol for measurements or use another framework if you're required by law. So you don't have to double dip if you're captured under a different program. So it's a really important thing or nuance in the legislation, especially as you look at companies within the safeguard mechanism, as an example. So it's worth having a look at your client base or your internal company to see how you're currently being captured, and then adjust your methodology towards that. This is just a small thing, before now we're going to jump into the requirements themselves and examples, because we got a lot of feedback like give me examples. And so we've added a lot of those things that you might start to look at, a KPI around renewable energy usage, your intensity of GHG emissions, energy efficient gains, and so forth, and absolute emission reductions. I think that you will start adding to your disclosures and your internal performance as teams and committees.
Yeah. And just adding, if you go back there, Fons, and one of the most important things here, and I was actually having a meeting with someone who's in the audience right now just a little bit earlier, and I think one of the most important things here when setting out those KPIs in your climate reporting is that you're engaging with all of your stakeholders, and early on in the piece, you're speaking to your customers, you're speaking to those key contacts of yours to also understand what metrics are important to them, right? Because we or any software or any consultant will never know that unless you ask, right? So I think one of the most important steps in this process is speaking to all of your stakeholders, and that includes your customers, especially those who you have a great relationship with, and you can work with them on this journey because they're probably going through this as well.
Yeah, 100%. It's all about the question that you ask, right? I think we said that in the report launch. It's all about those questions and the doors that they open once you get a good answer. Quick snapshot of requirements: emissions, business exposure, and opportunities. Things like, you've never maybe thought about this in the past, but percentage of assets exposed to physical and transition risks, percentage of alignment between a business unit, a product line, an asset, people with climate-related opportunities. Capital deployment. We never had to think before about deploying capital towards managing these risks, unless maybe you're like already like in insurance or looking ahead in the property market and development. But this might be new to a lot of businesses in different industries. Internal carbon pricing, like I said, if use how it's being tracked and planned and so forth. And this link, it's touched on governance, but this is how you report those metrics. How are your executives getting paid, and the bonus structures or cash paid in relation to these climate related targets and strategies that you are implementing. So really kind of personal at this moment, because you are touching not just on strategy but on KPIs and remuneration of people. We are about to deep dive into the requirements. All right. Based on your feedback from the other sessions, we want to start with an example.
Sorry, Fon, before we do, can we just take one question quickly from Peter at that point there? Peter asked, are companies expected to report on metrics beyond greenhouse gas emissions and other cross-industry metrics?
Correct. So you are expected to report, bringing back here, on things like percentage of assets. As an example, report on metrics around remuneration. In this section, it is not just about overall absolute reduction in emissions, as an example. So you have to report the emissions and the target, but you also have to report your physical risks, the percentage of that, and so forth. And we're going to look at quantifiable in a monetary way and also as a percentage of. So yes, 100%, it is more than just emissions when it comes to reporting these metrics and targets.
Fantastic. And great question, Peter, as well. Thanks for that.
An example of a manufacturing company, okay? Back in the day, it might have been easy to just go, we want to reduce scope 1 and 2 emissions by 40% from this baseline. Now you have to add to that target a disclosure breakdown, things like metrics used, okay, reduction, how it was measured in the first place. This is actually a gross reduction. The objective, and the objective linking, okay, it's a science-based target that you're trying to achieve, as an example. Part of the entity, so you might have different groups. Does this apply to the overall organization, or maybe just the Australian operation, or maybe just the New South Wales operation? Okay, so it's really important to have these targets being specific to one part of the entity or the all of it. Before, we kind of throw away the targets as absolute reduction, but then you read between the lines and you only have part of the business, part of your organization. So it's really important to detail these things. The other one is the period, right? Making really clear on the date of that reduction, and then adding milestones. So if your goal is by 2030, what's going to happen in the meantime? So the addition of milestones towards that goal that you can track, then link to the KPIs, is super, super important. The other thing as well, like I said, type of target, if it's absolute or it's relative, the scopes that it's covered, and of course the gross and net again. So things that you add that is more about just getting to a boardroom and setting a target because your colleagues or your competitors have done something similar. Now you have to break it down into something a bit more robust. Okay.
And just adding to that, Afonso, and answering Peter's sort of second part to his question that he sent in, where he said they are the cross-industry metrics, and yes, and then are other metrics optional. So as Afonso covered off on before, you've got your emissions, your scope 1, 2, 3, your exposure and your risks, your capital deployment, and those risks and opportunities as well. Important to remember the opportunities. Carbon price, as I mentioned before with the Microsoft example, and Afonso has driven home the remuneration linked points all series. They're your required for all companies, cross industry metrics, no matter what. Beyond cross industry metrics, when we're now looking at some optional but encouraged things is where we're looking at, industry specific metrics that might be per material or per usage or a unit of measurement. And then additional voluntary metrics that might be linked to bottom line, and yeah, very specific aspects like that. So there's the required for all, and then there's the optional but encouraged.
And then there's the third part of that, which is by sector. If you fall within certain sectors, you have to report certain metrics, like financed emissions of your insurance and so forth. So really important to look at your appendix within the legislation if you fall within those particular sectors. Now, what are the key metrics used to track this progress against climate-related goals? Like we said, bringing it home, your scopes, your percentage of assets, capex, which we'll give an example, climate-related capex, KPIs, linked to remuneration, and the clear definitions and data sources of what has been used. You've seen this table before in a different format, but these are metrics that you need to showcase on that report. Good example, how do you report on a metric like emissions inventories? Could be a table. It's as simple as that. Now, what is important is that this table is compliant with the GHG protocol. So you have the breakdown of scopes, you have your market-based and location-based. Please note that WSSB only asks for the location-based if needed, but you need to disclose other market instruments in your energy consumption. And understand there is then the breakdown to inform your users of, especially in that scope 3, where are emissions coming from and how you are aggregating or separating those emissions. The important thing to note as well, and I don't have it here, is I have it later in the presentation. Your notes. What are those assumptions? What are the emission factors? What are the boundaries? All of that needs to be documented when reporting your greenhouse gas emissions. We're not going to deep dive into how to measure in all the breakdowns in all the scopes. This is more just for the principles of reporting and alignment with the disclosure. Any questions on this aspect around carbon emissions? Please do let me know.
I think we're all good.
Yep. All right. Something new that hasn't been seen before. Portion of your company's assets or activities that are vulnerable for climate-related risks and opportunities. Exposed to physical risk, exposed to transition risk. So a good example, maybe Locke, you can deep dive into buildings and neighbors ratings, right? New assets that because of legislation, because of changes in procurement processes that now need to have certain climate resilience and efficiency in operations that are beyond just the physical risk of that asset, and it's more about how they exist in the regulatory space and the demand from clients and vendors and legislation as well.
Yeah, spot on. This is where we talk about those transitional risks, of course, and it's beyond just the physical risks that you can mention there. We now have requirements for government agencies to be in at a minimum a 5.5-star neighbours rating for both their base building and their tenancy rating. So this is to someone who runs a property business, this is a huge transitional risk for them because this has came about from them and because of that new policy. So perfect example of a transitional risk.
Yeah. And then we're going to go into the scenario analysis, mapping, financial planning, or strategy, and how you link to those. A good example, right? Metric: amount and percentage of assets vulnerable to climate-related physical risk. And I hope you appreciate the examples based on your feedback. And this is what something like this looks like. Indicates this is a financial quantification if you have available, right? If not, you have a percentage of those assets. And then you link this to what is actually the risk, and you link that risk might be storms and flooding. It could have been bushfires, it could have been landslides if you're like in a different part of the world. So that's how you kind of put this into a disclosure statement, and of course you have to provide all the evidence. But so you went from something that was just abstract as something you have to report to a quantifiable disclosure statement that goes into your annual report.
And sorry, Fonz, Peter's got another great question. How do you define vulnerability? It's really simple, and it's just how exposed are you and how sensitive are you to the impacts of climate change. So it's both for your physical and for your transitional related risk. That's your vulnerability. Yeah.
And the output of that will be a matrix, right? That normally you start off like, what's your exposure, what's your sensibility to that, and then you might like high to low, and you combine those factors to pinpoint that vulnerability. And then if you're gonna go and financially quantify that, it's a different story where you look at, if you look at physical buildings, the cost of repair or the cost of upgrades. If you look at production lines, the cost of changing logistical partners or changing mode of transport. So it really depends. But the initial vulnerability assessment, you go on exposure and sensibility to that.
Exactly. You're always going to have a capacity to be adaptive, and that needs to be considered as well. We are solutions first at NetNata, and we're always looking for ways to implement great sustainable solutions. So yeah, that adaptability is really important as well. But before looking at how you can be adaptive, you need to look at how exposed you are.
Now, the next one, how do you integrate these targets in financial planning? Really hard, linked with financial team. It is not a sustainability role alone. And you look at things, CapEx and OpEx, interim targets. Like I said, you have the final goal, 2030. What happens between now and then? Incentivize, because if you're going to incentivize executives and people with these targets, you're going to impact, of course, cash flow, and how finally they affect investment or divestment from a sense of procurement, but also from R&D as well, right? So might be just thinking, where do I put more money, but also where do I remove money that I'm currently like allocating to certain product lines, certain markets, certain investments that you might reallocate. So a good example is, this is just looking at the remuneration, right? Element of this with executive management. You can look at disclosure and you can see things like 15% of the award is directly linked to a specific indicator, and that indicator might be the overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so you've linked remuneration with an indicator. That indicator happened to be emissions. Now, if you're setting targets, that it's go beyond emissions, they go about assets, new investments, new opportunities. To make it realistic, that user of the report, the person reading it, the bank as an example, would want to know how achievable or realistic they are, from a sense of, do you have the people in space in place to make this happen? So they might want to see this linkage in remuneration, not only targeted at emissions, but also at finding new market opportunities or making your assets more resilient to climate change, as an example.
Yeah. And I think, like, with some examples there, it is always important to, like, this seems like a foreign world, this seems like a completely new thing, but it is important to sort of step back and look at other scenarios where this has already occurred before, right? And I think a good way to look at it is, if we look broadly at ESG metrics like diversity and inclusion, equity and inclusion, or if we look at things like safety, right? Safety is now just a part of all of our jobs, but it wasn't 10, 15, 20 years ago. And now these things are just included by most companies. I'd say over 3/4 of companies can include their safety scoring in their executive incentive plans, right? So thinking it in that way probably helps you see it a bit more easily as real and potential.
Finally, not finally, but like as a next step, we have this capital deployment. And deciding where capital goes is a hard decision as an organization. But now you look at funds being divested from high emission assets, supporting those climate goals, investment in renewables, and that's what like Lockie will touch in that webinar with our partner. What does it look like to have a strategy around that? And of course, deployment of that capital over time, and the climate risk associated with those financing decisions. So now you really go in, maybe the access to capital really changes depending on what are you doing with that capital internally and externally as well. When you go from that to just focusing on that scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions, which is something that we are very familiar in. And Loki, just a question, how are we for time?
Yeah, we're good. We're looking good.
When you deep dive into something that we are familiar with, and in our research report, this section was what people are most comfortable with, because we have seen carbon neutrality, we have seen emissions reporting in the past, so it's not as new. But the difference now is that you have to touch on emission factors. You have to touch on the type of activity and what you used. You have to touch on your boundaries, and all of this together makes for your disclosure, not just the end number. So, what tools and systems have you used? Right? Would they directly measure these emissions, or they were estimated based on certain like proxy data and so forth? How have you included scope 3, and which categories have been measured? What methodologies? Is activity based, spend based? If you didn't have access to activity, what were your assumptions? Were you modeling that? How were those inputs, and have you disclosed that? And what's your internal review process, depending if you would have different regions, who's signing off on that final number before it gets rolled up into a total company number? Do you have external assurance at which part of the process? All of that comes into play when you track and report. A good example as well is, how often are you tracking these, and are you improving the systems to track? And this is an element of, maybe what you had in place today doesn't function anymore because you don't look at things like inflation, currency conversions, access and cost to the right emission factors, right? Because there's a nuance there of, you need to pick the best category and best emission factor for that activity. So now you have systems of AI that help you that, reduce fatigue and so forth. And the approach of maybe tools or even consultants who function in a bit of a black box model of, give me your numbers, I'll spit out the output, they start losing credibility, because the process to get to the final number is as important as the final number.
Yeah, I totally agree, Fonzo. And I think like the driving point of this slide and the key takeaway is just making sure that you have that consistency in your measurements, and making sure that you're putting it into regular process to review this, to make sure you're checking things like your emissions factors, that they're being updated. You know, it needs to become part of the process for you to get comfortable looking under the hood of how all these calculations are made, and not just assuming that they're done the correct way.
Yeah. And now I'll give you some examples, right? Some report notes. So before I showed you like the table, right? I've showed you, okay, this is my total emissions. Now it's, how have you done your assumptions for the different scopes and what has been used? I'll give you an example of a short report note, but also a breakdown that could potentially be a table. And that table looks something like this. What's the scope? What's the category? What's the activity? What's the data source? What emission factor was used, the source of that and who published it? The methodology, what's the data quality? Do you have low uncertainty, high uncertainty on that? And finally, any additional notes that you might add. A good example is, this region could not be measured because there was a problem with the data, or we didn't have access. So there's all these things that now you have to showcase as part of your reporting. And a very good example is just the data source. Are you using a sensor? Are you using modeling, activity data, invoices, general ledger data? All of these things now play a role into the quality of your disclosure. And especially in the scope 1 and scope 2, you're going to be audited on this. So it's really important that you have everything in a very good central place, or your software tool is providing you access to how things were done in that process. So big
So
change.
Fonzo, just
Yep.
yeah. Who have we got
Go ahead.
there? Sorry, I thought I had someone else speaking through,
Mm.
but just on this slide, and let's say, putting ourselves in the shoes of a sustainability manager who feels really, really strong on scope 1 and 2, but not so much on scope 3, and they're not 100% confident on the methodologies that have been used and the data sets. They don't really know what notes they can add. What would be your suggestion to a person in that position?
I think if you've done this in the past, but maybe you never produced this type of documentation, I would look at existing reports of companies that maybe have documented that way. I would look at solutions who have maybe done more carbon accounts than yourself, right? And the solution might be a software tool, might be a consultant plus a software tool, and look at, okay, if this has been audited in the past, as an example, or has been validated and used for public reports, then hedge your bets on that. And finally, ask upfront what's going to be the methodology. What types of things would you be able to output when it comes to the process and the method? What is your policy around use of emission factors? So you can ask for the evidence even before you even run the numbers. And secondly, go into a place that maybe offers you the chance of uploading previous inventory data or previous calculations, and try to run a bit of like a scenario analysis in your emissions reporting to see how comfortable you are with that level of granularity or data sources or documentation.
Can I just add one piece to that answer, Fonz? And I think it's a great answer. But one thing that we, and you especially leading it, always do when working with our clients in their AASB reporting is making sure early on we're engaged with the auditor. And I think in this piece, if you've got any questions or you're feeling unsure as a sustainability manager, a very good early step is to engage directly with the auditor, to the points that Fonzo just made there, to make sure what is actually being checked and how it is being checked, so you can create that robust and compliant response.
100%. And if you engage, a consultant, or engage, a sustainability engine like NetNata, that first point of net kickoff is, let's bring the auditor in and ask, what are you going to be requesting? Of course, we have our way that has been checked by certain people, but if this is a new auditor and they want to review that, make that early in the process to make sure that when you get to the end, is actually something that you get assured. 100% lucky.
Awesome.
All right, we are on the home stretch.
Indeed.
That progress of your emissions reduction, like I said, it's super important. And this is looking at reduction. You might have for the first years like an uptick before you can get into like a reduction scenario, or you're waiting on part of your industry or sector to decarbonize, getting green cement before you can actually do your stuff. So there's a lot of things in play, but when and how are you tracking this and by whom is super important. And not only looking, like I said, at the last normally 2030 target or 2040, what happens in between those is super important. And in the example that I gave before, I actually showed you how it's done. How do you link this to performance? Okay, if you're going to use this as one of the indicators, show and quantify how it links to performance. And emissions tend to be the easiest one because you can really be robust about gross reductions. Okay, but you can also look at deployment of capital as your indicator and so forth. And then how we strategy adjust, because if you tell me you're gonna have a goal in 2030 to reduce absolute emissions, you also need to link that back to your strategy documents that you've done in the other pillars that make it realistic that you're going to achieve that. Okay, that you're able to deploy the capital, you're able to change how you do business, look into new lines of products, look into different markets and regions to achieve that. Okay, so not just a target, but actually how do you get that, including your milestones.
And I think, Afonso, to your point just before about, there's so many good resources out there to look at as to what other companies have done, and especially, the companies who are really leading the space. When we're looking at progress and how to track our progress, this has been something that's been a part of TCFD forever. And companies who are publishing their TCFD reports are very clear about their targets and are very clear about their progress on those targets, as are most companies who have been publishing their annual sustainability reports. So, like I know, for example, Telstra has reduced 37% of their emissions from their 2019 baseline to their last financial year report. This is exactly how they show those reductions and how they've actually been actively going after scope 1 and 2 reductions, scope 3 reductions. And you can, if you want to, you can go back and read, Telstra's last 5 sustainability reports and see year on year how they've done that, and most importantly in this context, how they've actually managed to report on that really clearly and transparently.
Now, just an example as well, looking at SASB, and I'll send you some links afterwards. What are the material things, as an example, and what are other industry leaders that have disclosed in that way are doing? It's a really good example to kind of set your foundations, but then make sure that you apply this to your organization and look, how do I become a leader, or how do I do my own thing based on my internal knowledge? Because of course you don't disclose everything. Things stay between you and your auditor, and that won't be available in that public report. So there's always something behind the scenes on how things were done, on those targets were achieved. And that links to that capital investment, right? Percentage of, what's the dollar value or percentage of your budget that actually goes to this? So we've set a target, emission reduction as an example. How many dollars do I need to get there? And how do I track those? So super key to set the target and then the path to get there. And that path might be strategic, but it is also financial. And you need to be able to put a number or a percentage of budget in there. This might not make your public report if it's like confidential with your organization and so forth, but you still need to show this to your auditor, and that is key. It goes into your audit pack on how these things get done when assurance comes into this area. All right. And then how do you classify and how do you track things over time, and how do you report change year on year? And remember, when you do financial budgets, things change, and in projections change, and market changes. So it doesn't have to be set in stone, and if you miss it, all it's doomed. But you need to project something and then showcase how far off you are from target. And maybe you actually need to deploy less money because some other solutions coming to the market made it cheaper to get there, or vice versa. You actually see a benefit on doubling down on these investments because it's good for your business, and then that percentage of expenditure changes. An example, okay, to make things easier, you're deploying $70 million by 2030. You set the metric, okay, the metric is capital expenditure. You set your target. It's investment in development and scaling of technologies to support low carbon economy. So a good example might be you're in the construction, or maybe you're like in the manufacturing space. What materials are you going to use that maybe might be more expensive today to lower the overall carbon of the product that you put into market, as an example, right? Or how do you invest in a fleet that maybe it's electrical and therefore lowers your fleet emissions? Then the parts of your entity, here it's really important to be specific, and it helps you to be specific. So is it about the global company, a line of products, a region, an area, a customer profile? Super key to do this. Base period, the milestone, and finally, how do you get informed on this target? Why have you set those? Maybe you look at competitors, you look at market research, you look at overseas markets like the European market, and then you map all of that into your own target, so it doesn't just come up out of thin air. And finally, how often are you measuring these targets?
I think
Might be
all of
just
that,
once a year.
all of that, of course, is so important. But the milestones are the big piece here for me, because the milestones allow you to make sure you're staying on track, and they also allow you to let your stakeholders know if you're looking like achieving targets or if you're looking like not achieving targets. So I think that's something that doesn't get spoken about enough. If the progress isn't shaping up to what the initial plans hoped it would be, you need to be in a good position to communicate that as early as possible. So having really well set out milestones allows you to clearly and confidently and transparently regularly report on your progress rather than getting almost to the finish line and saying, oh God, we're not going to hit it. So I think that's, really, really important part of this.
And we kind of like with these 12 things that we covered, you kind of set yourself up in a way of, okay, it's more than just emissions. There's other aspects. So I need to speed up the work that I'm doing in other sections of the disclosure to be able to nail this one. So by having this at the end is a bit of maybe a reverse logic where look at your metrics and targets that you need to put out there and then walk backwards to what needs to be done in the other parts of your disclosure. It
Exactly.
is maybe the easiest part of the disclosure, but it brings everything in. That's why it maybe has some complexity on information needed to achieve this part.
Exactly. Fons, I'm going to move you on to the questions now and let the audience have their last chance of asking any questions about today, because I know we're a bit short on time now. So please, everyone, the floor is well and truly yours, and follow Peter's lead of asking some really good questions. If there's anything that's unclear or anything that we can help you with from today's content.
Yeah. And there's also like the Lockie, check the Q&A as well, because not all questions go to the general chat, of course. And then one point as well is in terms of while you read to those questions, Lockie, is that there are tools that you can use, and those necessarily are softwares like NetNada, but there's things to get you there and to inform your stakeholders. We have surveys, we have reports, we have workbooks, published roadmaps. All of these things help you get your stakeholders involved in that conversation. And part of that might be introducing, our help in terms of like our sustainability engine. But there's other human touches that we can help you get there, that can help demystify the process of getting everyone into a room to start making some of these decisions. And you might start with just emissions, but things like doing a materiality assessment, doing like a gap analysis, really key to plan that roadmap. There's things you can do with us before you go measure your emissions, and that might soften the curve of how much you have to spend on this activity. And just as a nuance, Treasury has released a statement, right, when they were doing this, that the average cost for a Group 1 reporting company to do this is $1 million, all right, per year to be compliant. Now, this, of course, involves tools, consultants, and internal internal wages, but that's the magnitude of the task at hand. So don't feel overwhelmed, but try to do it one piece of the time and spread it out over your 18 months, 20 months roadmap if possible.
Awesome. Fons, we've got a question here from Laura. Hearing about multiple packs, i.e. one for auditors, another for external publication, one for the board, and another for the greenhouse gas protocol. What are your thoughts on how to do this efficiently?
Okay, so there's only one in terms of packs. There's two packs, I'd say. One, there's your final report. It's not a pack. That's your published, statements and financial report that's already been out there. You just now attach your sustainability section. In terms of things behind the scenes, that's your audit pack, which is your expert of all these documentations and policies and requirements that get given to your auditor. The best way to approach this is actually to use, now it's a bit of a bias, but to use software like NetNada. We've mapped all the requirements inside the NetNada software. So as you bring evidence, you can then have your auditor come in and look at all this information, and you can see how on track you are to a complete disclosure.
We promised that wasn't a planted question.
when when it comes to the board, right? It's about your education. Your board has limited bandwidth and limited time, and you have to show evidence that they are being educated, that they're on track of their governance responsibilities. So you have to distill a lot of this complexity into really short slides that go into a meeting agenda that you can present for 10 minutes to get things moving on. So when we talk about the board pack, is about upskilling the board pack, which is one of the major red flags or challenges. Have them agree on goals and what the science or like strategy behind those, and align on remuneration. Those are the biggest things, and those are not a long page report. That's a presentation that you put together with partners like Ternata to achieve that internal buy-in, either at the beginning of the project or halfway as you hit your milestones of materiality, gap analysis, emissions reporting, strategy, and so forth.
Yeah. Again, that's it's a question that really does align very well with NetNata and to everything Afonso said, but also just whether you're using NetNata or something else, but having a central data hub is so important because then you have all of the information right there. And this way you can go in and depending on the report that you need, slice that off, create it, provide it to whichever stakeholders. I think that's a really important point. But thank you for the question. All right, cool. It looks like there are no more questions. So from our side, just thank you. Oh no, that's a thank you. And well done, NetNata team. I expect there will be organizations that won't be compliant with standard. Some may need to state that up front.
There is a mechanism to ask for exemptions of the legislation, so that there is an open pathway. We don't, of course, know how many companies are applying for this exemption. We believe that the work with auditors is being extensive, and I don't think we can put a number of how many are going to be non-compliant, but some might have already strategic decisions of asking for exemption because of the quality of information available, as an example.
Yeah. And then Peter just had another question. If you don't currently have a target or internal carbon price, my understanding is that you just need to disclose this to be the case. Is that right? And yes, you are right. That is correct. So it's disclosure, not mandate. So yes, if you don't have an emissions target or carbon price yet, you simply just need to state that clearly in your report. So yes, correct, Peter.
Awesome. Again, remember, Peter, your users, and I'll get back to you in the nuances of that, how you do like a disclosure with non-target. Internal carbon pricing is optional. When it comes to emission reduction and other aspects, you might have to show some evidence of like it is not practical for your organization to achieve or to set one based on availability of information, as an example, or cost to get that information. It needs to be really, really, really robust. Awesome. Well, this was the last one. Really appreciate it. We'll email everyone with the resources and we start publishing the videos. Would love to show you how NetNata facilitates this reporting. But thank you for participating. It's been a fantastic 5 sessions. And I hope you have a fantastic end to your week. Thank you so much for being part of our community.
Thanks, team. Thank you, everyone.